trying to follow the threads between high-stakes politics, judicial power, and national security, you can feel pretty overwhelming, like you're juggling classified files in the dark.
It really can. It's dense stuff, often deeply contentious. And, the institutional implications are...
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why when you get access to, like, a really extensive, unfiltered interview with a sitting Knesset member, especially one like Tali Gotliv, well, it gives you this rare window.
A window into the real friction points, right? We're talking about direct accusations here, aimed squarely at some of the most powerful institutions in the country, the Supreme Court, the Attorney General's office, even the security.
Exactly. So our mission today is to kind of cut through all that political static and give you a clear map of the conflict she outlined. We're synthesizing the key facts, the specific allegations, and maybe most surprisingly, the really detailed systemic critiques.
And just for clarity for everyone listening, the surname is pronounced Gotliv, Gotliv.
Gotliv, okay.
And we need to be really upfront. Our job isn't to agree or disagree, but strictly to lay out her arguments as presented in the source material. These are, frankly, some pretty extraordinary claims against the judiciary and security body. Very politically charged.
All right. We're here to report, not endorse.
Precisely. We'll unpack the specific allegations against key figures, look at the structural flaws she highlights, and then get into her quite provocative ideas about strategy in the current conflict.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's set this political state.
Oh.
So we start right off with her take on institutional formalities. The interview kicks off discussing the opening of the Knesset session, and she's not exactly standing on ceremony.
No, not at all. She pretty much dismisses the whole thing, the pomp, the state ceremonies, the mitkasim mamlaktium, as she calls them. She sees them as just shows.
Just for appearances.
Yeah, it really sets her tone, Her focus, she says, is only on masim, practical actions, real work. She seems to view all the legislative theater as like a sideshow, a distraction from the tough job of actual governance and reform.
But it's interesting. She isn't just dismissing everyone in politics. She actually has some specific, pretty high praise for the Prime Minister.
That's right. Particularly when it comes to national security and national pride. She calls him basically unparalleled.
That's a crucial distinction, isn't it? It gives her critique a different weight because she's clearly coming from the political right, respects the coalition leader on policy.
It does. She sees him as the one person who can effectively project strength internationally. But, and this is a key pivot, that respect immediately flipped her core frustration with how he governs, specifically how he interacts with other institutions.
Oh, okay. And that frustration is aimed squarely at the judicial system.
Exact. She thinks the prime minister is just too, how does she put it, noble and statesmanlike towards the court. Like he's operating under this assumption that they're all playing by the same rules or have the same goals.
And she sees that nobility, that statesmanship, as a kind of weakness, something being exploited.
Precisely. She delivers this really sharp line that just encapsulates the whole con for her. It's the ideological core.
Really,
she says something like, he only forgets, Mr. Prime Minister, you forget that they scorn him and scorn us, that they being the judiciary.
Wow. So it's not just disagreement, it's contempt. Contempt for the elected government, the voters.
That's her read on it, yeah. She sees the judiciary as actively hostile, not just a check or balance. So the PM's deference, in her view, isn't statesmanship. It's just opening the door for the judiciary to dominate. It's a zero-sum game.
A zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
That sets a pretty stark stage for the specific clashes she detailed. Okay, so this alleged institutional scorn isn't just an abstract idea for her. It gets a very specific face. Supreme Court Justice Yitzhak Amit. And ironically, the flashpoint she starts with is actually an act of courtesy from the Prime Minister.
Right, it's quite the setup. The PM, in a public speech, calls Justice Amit president, giving him that honorific usually reserved for the actual head of the court, even though Amit isn't the president.
It's a regular justice at the time.
Exactly. And Gotliv sees this gesture of respect as completely misplaced, especially given what she alleges about Amit's actions and attitude, both on the bench and behind them.
So what are these specific allegations? How does she build this case? The Justice Amit thinks he's above the elected government.
Well, there are a few layers. First, there's the language. She claims that during court discussions about government decisions, cabinet decisions, Amit referred to the ministers, the elected ministers, as a cheerleading squad.
Cheerleading squad. Ouch. That's more than dismissive. That's degrading.
It absolutely is. It implies they have no independent thought, no professional role, just partisan followers. That's the implication draws.
But it goes beyond language, right?
Yeah.
She suggests he poses a more systemic threat to the PM's actual ability to govern. govern.
Oh, definitely. She claims Amit routinely annuls government, cancels them. And this is a big one. She alleges he wouldn't hesitate to declare the prime minister incapacitated. The term is
Nafsarut, incapacity.
Yeah, and she hammers this point. She believes the judiciary has absolutely no legal authority to make such.
Let's pause on Nafsarut for a second. That term carries a lot of weight. Recent legal baggage in it. Why is the idea of a judge declaring a PM unfit so explosive constitutional?
Well, it's supposed to be the ultimate check, right? For when a leader is truly medically or mentally unable to function. But if a judge, not the Knesset, not some formal medical body, can just declare it.
It basically bypasses the entire democratic process.
Exactly. It potentially gives the unelected judicial branch the power to remove a sitting prime minister unilaterally. So for Gotliv, Amit, even considering this alleged peak of judicial error, crafting a fundamental line.
And she also mentions specific administrative roadblocks he supposedly put up.
Yes, she alleges Amit imposed certain conflict of interest to the prime minister, specifically designed, in her view, just to make it legally difficult.
So the language, the alleged threat of Nafsarut, the administrative hurdle.
It all points in her narrative to one thing. Amit believes, quote, he is above, meaning above the prime minister, above the elected government.
Okay, we have to shift now to what is probably the single most startling claim in the whole interview. This moves way beyond political clashes into the sort of deep institutional memory of the justice system itself, the deleted indictment.
Yeah, this is the nugget that really caught attention. It's a bombshell allegation. Gotliv claims that Justice Yitzhak Amit years ago had an indictment filed against.
An indictment? For what?
Against him, his brother, and some others. It concerned planning and building offenses related to a property. Not minor stuff, apparently significant land use.
And there's a complicating factor here, right?
Yeah.
Something that got his name.
Precise. The claim is the original indictment listed Amit under his former surname, Goldfein.
Goldfein.
Yeah. So the implication, whether intended or not, is that the name change makes tracing this historical charge much harder within the legal record.
But the core accusation, the really serious one about the system's integrity, is what allegedly happened to that indictment file.
Right. Gotliv claims this indictment was nemachak, expunged, wiped clean, with no public explanation, no official court ruling making it disappear.
Just gone.
And here's the kicker, the part that suggests a potential cover-up. She alleges his name was deliberately removed from the justice system's database hierarchy.
Wait, is that even possible? Don't records usually stay, even if someone's acquitted?
That's exactly her point. Normally, in the Israeli system, names stay in the database history. Maybe flagged as closed or acquitted, but the record remains. To have a name actively erased, especially in relation to an indictment, that's a major anomaly. It suggests, if true, an intentional act of protection from within itself.
So if this claim holds water, it's not just about Amit's past, it's about the system potentially manipulating its own records for one of its own, a sitting Supreme Court justice.
It fundamentally questions the institutions and yes. She's using this story to ask the PM, basically, why show deference to a figure who, she alleges, benefited from the system covering up potentially past charge. It suggests a double standard.
This whole conflict, this sense of scorn she perceived, it also becomes very personal for her. She talks about a direct confrontation she had with Justice Amit in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, this anecdote is powerful for her art. It aims to show his alleged indifferent regard for the public, especially those suffering. She recounts challenging Amit about how the court was treating bereaved families, shkulu.
Families who've lost soldiers.
Yes, and she claims that because of her challenge, she was forcefully removed, literally dragged out by court guards.
Dragged out of the Supreme Court.
That's her account. And she makes a point of mentioning the parents of a fallen soldier, Shir Hajjaj, claiming they were also dragged out, and Amit showed no concern.
So for her, this isn't just about courtroom decorum. It's proof of his character.
It's evidence in her eyes that he fundamentally scorns the public, their grief, their right to even voice dissent in his courtroom. It reinforces her whole narrative about his personality and judgment.
And all this, the history, the alleged actions, the personal confrontations, it leads her to define Amit's core judicial philosophy with a really loaded term, megalomania. What did he allegedly say about democracy itself?
Well, the quotes she attributes to him are quite something. She claims that during a lecture to law students, Amit said that electoral democracy, rule by majority vote is no longer modern.
No longer modern. So what's the alternative?
Well, the implication is that authority has to lie somewhere else, right? Not with the messy will of the people expressed at the ballot box. It suggests a kind of post-democratic view.
And where does he supposedly think that ultimate authority does lie?
This is maybe the most telling part. She claims Amit referred to himself as Haposek Haharon, final arbiter.
The final arbiter.
Yeah. And not only that, but he allegedly likened himself to the Shulchan Aruch.
The Shulchan Aruch, the ancient foundational code of Jewish law.
Exactly. That's a massive claim. It's not just saying, I have the final legal say. Comparing yourself to the Shulchan Aruch. It's almost a theological claim to absolute legal authority, placing his judgment above everyone. Above the Knesset, above the people. Megalomania.
Okay. So the critique widens out from Justice Amit to the structure of the legal system itself, specifically the role of the Attorney General, the Yotzet Mishpatit Lamemshel. Gotliv highlights what many observers actually agree on, even if they disagree on the solution. There's an inherent conflict of interest built into the job right now.
Yeah, this is where we get into the nuts and bolts of structural stuff that fuels so much political deadlock. The AG currently wears two massive hats, right?
Right.
First, she's the government's top legal advisor. Her advice is considered binding on many things. Second, she's the head of the entire state prosecution system, the nation's chief prosecutor, essentially.
So she advises the government on legality, on policy, but she's also the person who could ultimately decide to prosecute members of that same government. That sounds problematic.
It's the definition of a conflict, yeah. Gotliv definitely sees it that way. She argues the AG is advising the government on policy, maybe even helping draft decisions, while potentially, as she puts it, working against them behind the scenes, maybe gathering info for future investigations or challenges.
And the real kicker here, the crucial piece of information for understanding why this is such a mess, is that the AG's advisory role, the really powerful part, isn't actually clearly defined in law.
Exactly. This is key. Let's unpack that. The only part of her job that is clearly laid out in primary legislation is her role as head of criminal prosecution that's in the criminal procedure law. Oh. But her power to advise the government, to tell the PM or ministers what they can or can't do legally, the power that causes all the friction, that's based almost entirely on decades of Supreme Court rulings, Sika, and the fact that governments have just sort of accepted those rulings over time.
Wait, so the power that constantly clashes with the elected official, that power was basically established by the court itself through its own ruling, not by the Knesset passing a law.
That's the heart of the structural argument from the right, yeah. The judiciary sees it as settled precedent, part of the constitutional fabric. But people like Gotliv see it as judicial overreach, power taken, not granted by legislation. That's why they argue the AG's power is effectively unchecked, because its boundaries aren't written down in law by the elected legislature.
Which leads directly to the big reform idea, splitting the role. What's the thinking there from people like N.K. Rotman?
The logic is pretty straightforward separation of powers. You take those two conflicting hats and give them, one person becomes prosecutor or state attorney.
Okay.
The other person becomes the government's legal. But, and this is crucial for the rougher, that advisory role clearly defined law, spelling out when the advice is binding, when it's just advice, what the limit.
But Gotliv, even though she wants reform, she has a specific worry about just splitting the role without doing something else first.
Yeah, it's a technical but important point. She's concerned about the sequel. She argues if you just split the role before you pass a law, defining the scope and limits of the advisory power,
you haven't actually solved the core problem.
Exactly. You might just end up with two AGs, as she puts it, two powerful figures whose advisory authority is still based on that ambiguous Sika, not clear law. She insists you have to define the power in legislation first, nail down the rules, and then you can split the role effectively.
And this whole structural issue, this ambiguity, it creates real day-to-day pressure on government ministers, doesn't it?
Yeah.
She talks about how the AG's office drafts government decisions.
Right. It's a subtle form of influence. When the government's own top lawyer hands you a complex legal document, a decision drafted by their team, there's immense pressure just to sign it.
You don't want to look like you don't understand, or worse, like you're trying to do something illegal.
Precisely. Ministers feel pressured to go along to avoid appearing stupid or legally vulnerable. But Gotliv pushes back hard against that dynamic.
She has a very memorable way of putting it.
She does. She says she'd rather look completely stupid in a meeting, asking basic questions, challenging the legal reasoning, than be an intelligent mute.
An intelligent mute, meaning someone who just signs off without really understanding or agreeing, just out of fear.
Yeah. Fear of looking dumb or fear of legal trouble down the road. She's essentially calling for ministers to assert their political authority, their mandate, even if it means clashing with the legal bureaucracy. Don't just nod.
All right, let's shift gears now. We're moving from the courts and the legal system over to the security and intelligence world, specifically the Shin Bet, or Shabak, and its head, Ronan Bar. Gotliv levels some incredibly serious accusations here, covering both alleged operational failures and political meddling.
Yes, the focus shifts dramatically. And she starts with something very concrete, very specific, that sounds, frankly, unbelievable for a top intelligence. What she calls the missing phones scandal.
Missing phones?
Not just phones. 800 phones and laptops allegedly stolen from a Shin Bet warehouse.
800 devices from inside the Shin Bet. That's a massive breach, isn't it? These could be highly sensitive.
You'd certainly think so. And her core accusation isn't just that the theft happened, but that the investigation afterwards has been, well, lacking, or maybe even deliberately slow.
What makes her say that?
She basically asks, how has this not been solved? She points out the Shin Bet has incredible tracking capabilities that can track vehicles, movement, electronic devices. How could 800 devices just vanish without a trace, and the agency can't figure out where they went or who took them?
So the implication is?
What?
Incompetence or something else.
It's a heavy implication, either shocking incompetence or, perhaps more darkly, that the agency isn't really trying to solve. Maybe because the truth points to an internal failure or cover-up that's too embarrassing or politically damaging to reveal.
Wow. Okay, so beyond that alleged operational failure, she also accuses Ronan Barr direct of political interference.
Yes, she makes some very direct claims. First, that Barr allegedly ordered investigations into sitting government ministers elected.
Investigating ministers.
On what ground?
She doesn't detail the grounds, but the implication is political motivation. And second, she claims he warned against the penetration of Zionism into the police.
The penetration of Zionism? What does that even mean in this context?
It frames the security service, or at least its leadership in her view, as being actively biased against certain political or ideological viewpoints within the government or society, specifically religious or nationalist elements, targeting the coalition, essentially. Okay, the next incident is fascinating. It involved a leak, a publication ban, and Gotliv apparently breaking that ban deliberately. It really shows her confrontational style.
It does. It's a complicated story. Apparently, a security figure leaked a sensitive document, a violation of state security protocols. A court then issued a gag order, a publication ban on the whole affair.
Standard procedure, often to protect security.
Right. But Gotliv believed the ban wasn't really about protecting security. She claims she thought it was a smokescreen designed to protect the person who leaked the document and cover up an abuse of power within the security apparatus. So she says she intentionally violated the publication.
Okay, that's a risky move. What happened then? What was the effect of her challenging the gag order?
Well, it forced the issue. Her public violation put pressure on the prosecution, who then had to ask the court to lift the ban.
So it brought the details out into the open.
Exactly. And Gotliv claims that once the information was revealed, it showed that the original leak came from someone who actually didn't have the proper authority to order the kind of internal investigation of ministers that the document related to.
So in her view, breaking the ban exposed an abuse of power that the system was trying to hide using that same ban?
That's her argument, yes. She basically used her parliamentary position and willingness to defy a court order to force transparency on what she saw as misconduct within the...
This leads us right into another really troubling area she discusses.
Yeah.
The Jewish division within the Shin Bet. This is the part of the agency that deals with internal security threats from Jewish Israelis, often settlers in the West.
Yes, and her accusation here is incredibly, very controversial. She alleges auto-anti-Semitism within the specific...
Auto-anti-Semitism, meaning Jews discriminating against other Jews.
That's the shocking claim, that there's an internal bias, an ingrained hostility, leading the division to treat certain groups, particularly religious settlers, with excessive suspicion, maybe even fabricating reasons for action.
Fabricating reasons? Does she offer any proof for such a serious claim?
She references a specific explosive piece of alleged evidence, an audio recording.
Oh, recording. Of what?
She claims there's a recording where a high-ranking Shin Bet officer tells a subordinate, she names him, Nitzaf Mo'alam, to basically make something up, to say, "You smell the smell of fuel," as a pretext to justify arresting a specific rabbi from a yeshiva in Yitzhak.
Wow. If true, that's not just bias, that's manufacturing evidence, that's illegal.
It would be systemic malpractice, yes.
Yeah.
Moving far beyond just ideological disagreement into outright fabrication by the security services against citizens based on their ideology or location, it's a depth.
And does she connect this alleged internal focus on the right wing back to broader security failure?
She does. She argues there's a dangerous imbalance. The Jewish division is intensely focused on the right, but there isn't a similar dedicated professional body within the Shin Bet tasked with investigating potential threats from the political left with the same vigor.
So an imbalance in focus.
Yes. And she believes this skewed focus, this obsession with one side, directly leads to blind spots and failure. She even cites the example of the Prime Minister's house shell, suggesting that maybe if resources were allocated more proportionally across the political spectrum, such things might be prevented.
Finally, in this section, there's a quick but telling anecdote about a new appointee, Aluf Zini, and a seemingly minor policy change.
Right. It highlights the internal resistance. Zini, apparently trying to align the agency with official Knesset law and government policy, instructed Shin Bet staff to use the term Judea and Samaria instead of the more politically neutral or contested term West Bank.
Just a change in terminology to match the law.
Exactly. A straightforward directive to comply with official language. But according to Gotliv, this internal briefing was immediately leaked to the press.
Leaked? Why?
The implication is that it was leaked by people inside the Shin Bet who resisted this change, who preferred the old terminology or opposed the political direction it signaled. It shows, for her, how deep the institutional runs, even down to the words.
Okay, let's move into the final section, which gets into the really big picture. The ongoing conflict, strategy, and how victory should even be defined. We start with her feelings about any potential ceasefire agreement. She sounds highly skeptical.
Skeptical is putting it mildly. High ambivalence bordering on outright rejection of the premise. She fundamentally argues that anyone thinking Hamas agreed to release hostages out of some kind of goodwill or successful negotiation is just naive about who they are.
So not a change of heart on Hamas' part.
Absolutely not, in her view. She insists Hamas only responds to one: overwhelming force and pressure, duress.
And she attributes the hostage release not to negotiation success, but to external factors.
Correct. She credits immense pressure from key outside players, specifically the financial backers and mediators like Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. She sees them pulling the strings, using financial and political leverage. It was transactional, not diplomacy in her.
To really understand Hamas's goal, she says you have to understand their core identity.
Yeah.
She defines them as the operative arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. Why is that distinction so important?
It's absolutely central to her entire strategic outlook. She draws a sharp line between groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, who aim for immediate violent imposition of Sharia law, and the Muslim Brotherhood, which she describes as sophisticated radicalists. They play a longer game. They use the tools of democracy, elections, political organizing, cultural influence as a means to an end.
And the end is still Sharia law.
Yes, but achieved gradually, often by working within the system they ultimately aim to replace.
Does she give examples of this strategy elsewhere?
She does. She points to the UK, specifically places like Birmingham and London, claiming the Muslim Brotherhood's method there is to win local elections, gain influence through democratic means, and slowly shift the governance and culture goal, using the system against itself.
And she ties this global strategy directly back home to the Knesset, and critically, back to her critique of the judiciary.
She asserts that there are Knesset members affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood sitting in Israel's parliament because the Supreme Court, and she names Justice Amit, again specifically, allowed them to run and
despite their alleged anti-state.
Despite what she considers their fundamentally anti-state ideology. So for her, the judiciary's commitment to democratic process, applied legalistic, has inadvertently opened the door to an existential threat, the gradual erosion character from
this whole philosophical framework about the enemy's long-term goal. It must shape her recommendations for war strategy, especially when it comes to trust and negotiation.
She brings up the Islamic concept of
Parmiya. What is that?
She explains it as a religiously sanctioned permission within Islam, specifically in the Quran, she claimed, to lie to the enemy, to deceive them during times of conflict or negotiation.
Okay, so if you believe that's part of their doctrine,
then you can't trust anything they say, right? Any talk of disarming or long-term peace or honoring agreements becomes inherently suspect from their own religious standpoint, according to her interpretation. Negotiation is just a stalling tactic, a way to regroup and continue the long war.
So, given that deep distrust, that belief in an enemy committed to eventual annihilation using any means necessary, what's her actual strategic recommendation? What should be done on the ground?
Her proposal is stark, punitive, and aimed directly at what she perceives as the enemy's core value. She argues Israel must hold the ground it has taken in northern Gaza and formally annex it.
Annex northern Gaza.
Yes, as an act of punishment. An eye for an eye, she said. A direct, tangible contact. And she's adamant this should be done regardless of international opinion, specifically mentioning it shouldn't matter what U.S. President Biden.
That's a major strategic shift, but it leads into what's probably the most provocative analytical point how victory itself should be. She says Israel needs to use the enemy's dictionary, not its own.
This is the absolute core of her strategic philosophy, and it's really challenging. She argues that Western or democratic metrics for victory counting, enemy casualties, destroying infrastructure are basically irrelevant because the enemy doesn't value those things in the same way.
So body counts don't matter. Buildings don't matter.
Not primarily, according to her analysis of the enemy's value. Concrete can be rebuilt, she implies, and martyrs are celebrated. Those aren't the things that signal defeat.
So what does matter? What's the core target if you want to achieve what the enemy perceives as defeat?
It boils down to one thing, she argued. The land.
The land.
Yes. Therefore, true victory, A victory that resonates in the enemy's own value must involve taking their land. That's the primary pain.
And it's not just taking land, she adds another element.
Yes, crucially, it must be combined with absolute humiliation, making the enemy feel degraded, spiritually broken. She gives visceral examples like sending pigs, hogs into the tunnels to desecrate their spaces. It's about psychological dominance and breaking their will through deep cultural offense, alongside territorial loss.
The idea of humiliation and revenge as explicit war aim, that's radically different from modern military international norms.
Radically different. And she acknowledges this clash herself. She mentions a conversation she apparently had with the IDF staff, Herzi Halevi. According to her, Halevi told her flat out that concepts like merciless warfare and revenge are simply not recognized military value. They're not part of the IDF's professional ethos or doctrine.
So that just lays bare the huge ideological gap, doesn't it, between her vision of this punitive, almost primal political warfare focused on land and humiliation, and the military establishment operating under, theoretically, a different set of rules and ethical constraints.
A profound disconnect. It highlights the tension between a political desire for absolute, crushing victory defined on the enemy's terms and the constraints legal, ethical, professional that a modern military #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has really traced two massive intertwined themes running through Tali Gotliv's critique based on this source material. On the one hand, you have this deep, almost visceral institutional mistrust.
Yeah, the specific allegations against Justice Amit, that whole mystery around the potential indictment, the structural arguments about the general's power, court rule, not law, and then the really serious claims about the Shin political bias, maybe even fabricating evidence. It's a full spectrum assault on the non-elected power.
And then woven through all of that institutional conflict is the second major threat, this demand for a completely different kind of strategy in the conflict, one that's far more punitive, based not on Israel's own value, but laser-focused on what she argues the enemy truly fears.
Exactly. Taking Allard, the land, and inflicting absolute humiliation, moving away from conventional metric success towards something much more fundamental, even primal.
It really is striking how all these seemingly separate pieces, a historical indictment claim, a debate about the AG's legal structure, a discussion about military strategy and annexation, they all seem to circle back to one core question that this material forces you to confront. Who actually gets to define the rules of the game? Who sets the boundaries of power in the state?
Is it the elected politicians fighting for what they see as their mandate and national survival?
Right.
Is it the judiciary defending decades of precedent and its role as guardian of the law? Is it the security establishment with its own doctrines and operational realities? It's a fundamental power struggle.
And maybe the final and most challenging thought M.K. Gotliv leaves us with through her arguments is this strategic dilemma. If you accept her premise that victory must be defined using the enemy's own harsh lexicon of land and humiliation, how does a state that sees itself as democratic, that's bound by international norms and its own laws, actually calculate the cost?
What is the true cost morally, diplomatically, politically, internally of pursuing a victory built on those foundations?
Yeah.
On annexation and deliberate humiliation. It's a question that really pushes at the boundaries of how a democratic state wages war, especially an existential one.
A deeply challenging question indeed, something for all of you listening to definitely continue thinking about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Yes, thank you. Until next time.